April 18th, 1943. Guadalcanal. Before sunrise, on a strip of pierced steel runway cut from jungle and coral, 12 twin-boom fighters wait under blackout tarps. Mechanics move like shadows, wrestling 330-gallon drop tanks under thin aluminium wings. Pilots climb in without chatter. They check their watches again. This mission will live or die by the minute. The airplane under them is not beloved. In ready rooms across two oceans, American pilots have rolled their eyes at it, called it the plumber's nightmare. Two airplanes bolted together, even the fork-tailed devil, a nickname meant as an insult until the enemy turned it into a warning. They don't have to like it. They just need it to do the impossible. Somewhere out there, 500 miles away, a formation of Japanese bombers and escorts is scheduled to cut through the morning air over Bougainville. A single passenger on one of those bombers matters more than the rest of the war's headlines put together. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. If the Americans can reach him, intercept him, and escape, the balance of power in the Pacific will shift again. Only one fighter in U.S. service can fly that far, that fast, and still fight when it gets there. The airplane is the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a machine many American pilots once laughed at. Within a year, they'll be whispering about what it can do. The Lightning began with a dare. In 1937, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a radical proposal: build a fighter that could fly over 360 miles per hour at high altitude, climb like a rocket, and carry heavy guns. Most companies sketched safe, single-engine designs. Clarence Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed team, young, hungry, and a little audacious, drew something else. Twin booms housing twin Allison V1710 engines, each with a General Electric turbo supercharger breathing cold, thin air and turning it into speed. They pushed all the guns into the nose, one 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber Brownings, so there'd be no wing-mounted convergence to worry about. The counter-rotating propellers would cancel torque. The tricycle landing gear would keep the nose up on rough fields. On paper, it looked like future tech. On the ramp, it looked like heresy. The prototype, the XB-38, first flew in January 1939 and promptly set a transcontinental speed record attempt, coast to coast in just over 7 hours, before icing and a carburetor issue sent it sliding across a frosty field short of the runway in New York. The headlines focused on the crash. Johnson focused on the data. The Army ordered more. What pilots noticed first wasn't the speed. It was the shape. Fighters don't have two tails, one instructor muttered. This thing looks like somebody forgot to finish it. On Southern California test flights, the P-38 climbed hard, ran cool, and pointed those nose guns like a spear. But it also carried secrets that would scare good pilots. At altitude, the airstream packed against the wings and tail with a force nobody fully understood yet. In steep dives, the P-38 approached compressibility, a region where shock waves formed and the elevator stopped answering. Control columns went heavy. Airspeed needles leapt past 450, 480, 500. Pilots pulled and nothing happened. A few lightnings drilled themselves into the sea while crews stared at empty horizon. On cold mornings, intercoolers iced and engines coughed. In long climbs, one Allison sometimes ran a different mixture than its twin. The airplane yawed and bucked. The cockpit was frigid. Heated suits were spotty. Over England, where the 8th Air Force would later try the P-38 in soupy winter air, pilots cursed stiff throttles and stubborn turbos. Solutions came fast, but not all at once. Lockheed replumbed the intercoolers. The J&L models added dive recovery flaps that kicked lift back into the tail and let pilots pull out safely at speeds past 500 mph. Engineers improved cockpit heating, added electric de-icing, and refined the engine controls. In each update, the Lightning learned to behave. It never became simple. It became masterable, which in wartime often matters more. Pilot number 1. Twin-engine fighter. If one quits, the other gets you to the crash site. Pilot number 2. Give me a P-40. At least it'll spin the way God intended. The jabs weren't baseless. A single-engine fighter feels alive on the stick. The Lightning felt engineered. It needed discipline, high-speed slashing attacks, energy management, patience. Instructors drilled new habits. If you dive, plan the pull-out early. Don't yank. Compressibility will punish you. If you lose one engine, stay above blue line, feed rudder, trim, trim, trim. It rewarded the methodical pilot and punished the impulsive one. Then came a theater where its strengths mattered more than its quirks. The South Pacific didn't care about elegance. It cared about distance. Islands lay strung across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. To protect bombers, to sweep enemy bases, to intercept far from home, you needed range and altitude, and a fighter that could loiter over the fight and come back with one engine dead and holes in the wing. The P-38 brought all of it. With drop tanks, it could reach 1,300 miles. At altitude, the turbo superchargers kept both Allisons shoving compressed air into the cylinders like it was sea level. The nose battery put every bullet along the same line. A 2-second burst from those guns didn't lace a wingtip, it cored a fuselage. And the twin engines, mocked stateside, suddenly looked like insurance when one took a hit and the other kept pulling. Japanese pilots met it first over Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Many flew the A6M0, light, agile, deadly at slow speeds, but fragile. The Zero's lack of armor and self-sealing tanks meant a couple of heavy .50 caliber hits often turned victory rolls into smoke. In vertical maneuvers, the Lightning's power made its own rules. US pilots learned to boom and zoom, never turning with a zero, always trading altitude for a clean, fast pass and climbing away. The Lightning wasn't a knife fighter. It was a spear. Behind every sortie was an American industrial story. The Lightning's GE turbo superchargers were precision machines, exhaust-driven turbines that crammed thin air into the engines so they could keep their rated power high above 20,000 feet. Factories learned to build them by the hundreds. Lockheed's Burbank plant ran 3 shifts, apprentices becoming experts in months. What the airplane demanded in complexity, the factories answered in repeatable process. The design itself spoke a language of redundancy. 2 engines, 2 generators, duplicate hydraulics, a tricycle gear less likely to nose over on rough strips, a concentrated gun pack that could fire long bursts without synchronizing through a propeller arc. It was the mechanical embodiment of a national philosophy. Overbuild it, give the pilot backups, and let production do the rest. Even with the Pacific winds, doubt lingered. The lightning took work. Pilots swapped stories about frozen fingers and stiff controls. Maintenance chiefs cursed leaky turbo plumbing and chased gremlins in intercoolers. And in the other theater, in cold northern Europe, P-38 groups still struggled to keep pace with changing demands. But on Guadalcanal, something had changed. When long missions came up, when the map showed an arrow stretching past what seemed flyable, the operations officer drew a lightning on the chalkboard. Door opens. A colonel enters with a folder marked Top Secret. Operations Officer. Gentlemen, what you hear now stays in this room. American code breakers had read a message they were never meant to see. Admiral Yamamoto's itinerary for an inspection tour of Bougainville and the Shortlands. Takeoff times. Routes. Altitudes. Down to the minute. There was one problem. The target would be nearly 430 miles from the nearest lightning base at the time of intercept. No P-40 or F-4F could make it. B-25s lacked the speed to guarantee a clean escape. The only fighter with the range, altitude, and punch was the one some pilots still teased in the mess hall. The mission planners ran the math on fuel burn, wind drift, and climb schedule. They factored drop tanks. They argued over cruise settings that left just enough for a few minutes of full power in the fight. Then they did something American air doctrine rarely risked so early in the war. They committed a dozen fighters to a single, precise ambush based on decrypted intelligence. April 18th, 1943. 12 P-38 GS of the 339th Fighter Squadron throttle up in pairs. The sound rolls across coconut palms and over the iron roofs of Henderson Field like distant thunder. One by one, the nose wheels lift. The forked tails rise into a bruised blue sky. At the front sits Captain Thomas Lanphier. Off his wing, Lieutenant Rex Barber. Behind them, Bisbee Holmes, Ray Hine, and the rest of the intercept flight. Their course line on the navigator's board is a thin pencil hair over hundreds of miles of featureless water. They will fly wave-skimming low to avoid radar, then climb exactly at the point a courier's schedule predicts Yamamoto's bombers will cross. Pilot VO, checklist cadence. Mixtures Z. Props zinced. Turbos alive. Fuel on mains, drop tanks feeding. God help the man who misreads a gauge today. On the Japanese side, officers are punctual by culture and creed. Yamamoto is more punctual than most. He once said a man who kept others waiting stole time he hadn't earned. At 09:45, he is scheduled to be airborne. At 10:00, crossing the coast. At 10:34, over Bougainville at about 4,000 meters. The lightnings must be there at 10:34, not 10:31, not 10:38, or the ambush dissolves into empty sky. April 18th, 1943. The sun had climbed just above the horizon when the 12 P-38 lightnings leveled off over the endless blue of the Solomon Sea. The coastline of Guadalcanal had long vanished behind them. Nothing ahead but the glittering Pacific and the quiet hum of twin Allisons. Each man in that formation knew a single mistake, a wrong heading, a premature climb, would doom the mission. They had no radio chatter, no margin for error, and barely enough fuel to reach Bougainville and return. Captain Thomas Lanphier checked his watch. They were 5 minutes ahead. He adjusted the throttle, easing the big fighter into a steady cruise at 210 knots. The formation fanned out in pairs, each pilot watching his gauges, tracing the whitecaps below for any sign of enemy patrols. At this altitude, barely 100 feet above the water, one lapse in concentration could end in a flash of spray. Back in the second element, Lieutenant Rex Barber flew tight on his leader's wing, eyes scanning the horizon. He thought about the man they were hunting, the same man who had conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor. For Barber, it was personal. For everyone, it was symbolic. They were flying into history, whether they came back or not. After 2 hours, the sea began to shift color, lighter turquoise hinting at reefs beneath. The navigators checked their charts, calculating drift by the angle of the morning sun. The time ticked closer to 10. They began their climb. The lightnings rose out of the sea haze like ghosts, their drop tanks glinting silver. Thin contrails trailed from the turbos as they gained altitude, 5,000 feet, then 10, then 15. Fuel gauges slid lower. There would be no second chance if they missed the intercept. At 10:33 local time, the first glimmer appeared ahead, dark specks moving against the cloud line. 12 o'clock high, about 4,000 meters. Lanfear's pulse quickened. He flicked his gun switch to arm and squeezed the trigger once, checking that his guns were live. He gave the silent hand signal forward, attack. The American formation split cleanly. 4 lightnings, including Lanfear and Barber, pulled up into the sun. The others stayed lower to guard their withdrawal route. Far ahead, the Japanese bombers, 2 Mitsubishi G4M Bettys, flew in neat formation, their long wings gleaming. 6 Zero fighters flew above and behind them like guardians. Lanfear's flight climbed into position, careful not to betray themselves with glare. The timing was perfect, exactly as the decrypted message had predicted. At 10:34, the Americans rolled inverted and dove. The Japanese lookouts saw them seconds too late. The sky erupted in white streaks as the P-38s screamed down from 18,000 feet, sunlight flashing off their twin booms. Barber fixed his sight on the lead bomber. His finger tightened on the trigger. 8.50 caliber Brownings chattered in unison, converging into a single, blinding line of tracers. The rounds tore through the bomber's left wing and cockpit. Smoke burst from the engines. Inside, Admiral Yamamoto's staff barely had time to react before the aircraft lurched, rolled, and plunged toward the jungle canopy below. Lanfear broke high to avoid the Zeros, his guns chewing into the second bomber. The enemy escorts, caught by surprise, dove in confusion, scattering to defend. 1 Zero tried to climb into a head-on pass and was shredded in an instant. Another managed to line up behind a Lightning before a covering pair of Americans sliced across its path and blew it apart with a single burst. Below, the first bomber hit the trees in a ball of orange fire. Fragments scattered through the forest. Witnesses on the ground would later describe a single body still strapped in the wreckage, dressed in the dark uniform of a Japanese admiral. The message had been right. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was gone. The fight above raged for only minutes. The Lightnings, short on fuel and ammunition, turned for home. Barber's voice crackled through the radio for the first time all day. Fuel check. Form up. Let's get out. 1 P-38 failed to answer. Lieutenant Ray Hine had been seen engaging 2 Zeros before disappearing into a cloud bank. He never returned. The others flew on in silence, throttled back to the most economical setting, conserving every drop. They had been airborne for nearly 4 hours, engines running hot, tempers cold. The coastline of Guadalcanal appeared just as the gauges neared empty. When they landed, ground crews rushed to count bullet holes, to shake hands, to confirm the impossible. The intercepted message had come true. Yamamoto was dead. The P-38 Lightning, once doubted and mocked, had carried out one of the most precise and audacious missions of the war. That night, the pilots gathered under dim lanterns in the briefing hut. They were exhausted, hollowed out by the tension, but the room felt charged with something new, respect. Word spread through the squadrons, faster than the official communiques. The Lightning had done what no other fighter could: fly nearly 1,000 miles, strike with surgical accuracy, and bring most of its men home. News of the mission broke weeks later. In Tokyo, morning ceremonies were held in silence. In Washington, the press called it Operation Vengeance. To the pilots who flew it, it had felt more like redemption. The P-38 Lightning had proven its worth not in theory, but in the crucible of a single morning over Bougainville. From that day forward, no one laughed at the fork-tailed devil again. By the summer of 1943, the name Lightning carried new weight across the Pacific. Japanese pilots who once mocked the bulky twin-boom silhouette now gave it a new title whispered with respect and fear: Naihikoki no Akuma, the two-plane devil. The P-38 had done the impossible once. Now it had to do it every day. The war was spreading. From New Guinea to the Marshalls, from the Solomons to the Philippines, the sky belonged to whoever could fly farthest, strike hardest, and come back alive. For the Americans, that meant the Lightning. Pilots of the 475th Fighter Group, men like Thomas Maguire, Charles MacDonald, and Richard Bong, learned to use the Lightning as an instrument of domination. They flew in small, tight units, always above their enemies, always ready to dive and climb out before a counterattack could form. The tactic was simple, brutal, and effective. Hit once, hit hard, and disappear into the sun. Each pilot carried the weight of experience from earlier disasters: friends lost in compressibility dives, engines that failed, fuel that ran out too soon. But now, every squadron on every Pacific island was learning the same lesson. Altitude and speed meant survival, and the Lightning owned both. It wasn't graceful like a Spitfire, nor as sleek as the Japanese Zero, but its power was unmatched. The twin Allisons could lift it to 30,000 feet and still keep climbing. Its turbochargers, hissing like angry kettles, gave the P-38 a roar unlike any other sound in the sky. When a lightning dove, the air itself seemed to split apart. Over the steaming jungles of New Guinea, pilots fought exhaustion, heat, and boredom as much as they fought the enemy. The missions were long, sometimes 8 hours from takeoff to landing. They flew over endless ocean, guided only by compass and instinct. A single navigational mistake could send them vanishing into blue emptiness, fuel gone, radio silent. And yet they flew. In the summer of 1943, young Richard Bong, a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin with an easy grin and an almost supernatural gift for aerial gunnery, scored his first kills in the Lightning. Bong had grown up shooting cans with a .22 rifle. Now, he used 8 Browning machine guns that could spit 120 rounds per second. He would later become America's top ace, 40 victories in the Pacific, all in a P-38. Bong loved the Lightning like a friend. He spoke to it before each mission, patted its nose, and named his aircraft Marge after his fiancée back home. His wingman said he could smell an enemy airplane before he saw it, and that when he pulled the trigger, he never missed. Further west, another pilot, Thomas Maguire, flew with a colder precision. Maguire's Lightning, pudgy, carried kill markings across its silver nose until it looked like a predator covered in scars. Maguire approached every mission like an engineer, studying enemy tactics, energy angles, and firing distances. Together, Bong and Maguire became legends, each pushing the other higher, faster, deadlier. By 1944, the Lightning wasn't just fighting, it was shaping the war itself. Its range allowed it to escort bombers deeper into enemy territory than any other fighter before the arrival of the Mustang. From Port Moresby to Rabaul, from Bayek to Balikpapan, the P-38s were always first in and last out. Japanese pilots began to dread the glint of sunlight on twin tails. They learned that diving away didn't work. The Lightning followed. Climbing didn't work either. The turbos kept the Americans strong, even above 30,000 feet. And if they tried to turn, the Lightning simply zoomed out, waited, and came back from above with another burst of .50 caliber fury. But no matter how many victories they scored, the Pacific Airmen paid in sweat and nerves. They fought not just the enemy, but the jungle, the ocean, and the vast distances between islands. Each mission began with the smell of fuel and ended with the sting of salt air on cracked lips. There were nights when pilots returned with their engines coughing, one propeller feathered, landing lights flickering, and the ground crews counted bullet holes instead of victories. The mechanics learned to patch the Lightnings with anything they had: beer cans, scrap aluminium, even pieces of wrecked Japanese planes. The Lightning was tough, forgiving, and stubborn. It could limp home on one engine with the other smoking. It could take hits that shredded other fighters and still fly straight. It was heavy, yes, more than 7 tons fully loaded, but that weight carried armor, redundant systems, and a structure strong enough to take punishment that would tear a Zero in half. By late 1944, the Lightning had evolved. The J and L models featured dive recovery flaps, improved controls, and heaters that finally worked. The pilots who had cursed the airplane's quirks now praised it as the best friend a man could have at 30,000 feet. In the Philippines, Lightnings escorted bombers during the liberation of Leyte and Luzon. They strafed convoys, destroyed airfields, and shredded Japanese shipping with guns, bombs, and rockets. Their long noses flashed with flame as they dived on enemy columns. When they pulled up, nothing below still moved. In every squadron, camaraderie ran deep. Pilots shared rations, letters, jokes, and fear. They scrawled names of sweethearts on engine cowlings and chalked mission tallies under the cockpit. Some days they returned to find their friends, bunks empty, the names crossed off the roster, replaced by new faces who'd learned the same lessons soon enough. But through it all, the P-38 proved itself again and again. It wasn't the prettiest airplane. It wasn't the easiest. But it had range, power, and the one thing every pilot wanted most, a chance to come home. And as the Pacific tide turned, the Lightning led the way west, toward the Philippines, toward Iwo Jima, and eventually toward the heart of Japan itself. By early 1945, the roar of the P-38 Lightning echoed across every front of the Pacific War. The islands that had once seemed invincible strongholds of the rising sun now burned under American air superiority. From the Philippines to Okinawa, the Lightning had become the long arm of vengeance, sleek, brutal, and unstoppable. Each new campaign pushed it farther north, closer to Japan. New airstrips carved from coral and volcanic rock stretched its reach. New tactics turned it from a fighter into a weapon of annihilation. The same machine that had once been laughed at as overcomplicated now struck fear in the hearts of veteran Japanese aces. At dawn, Lightning squadrons launched in pairs, heavy with fuel and ordnance. Beneath their wings hung bombs or rocket pods, and each nose bristled with the same lethal battery that had defined the war. 4.50 caliber Brownings and a 20mm cannon, all aimed directly forward. The pilots called it the hammer. One 2-second burst could tear a bomber in half, rip through tanks, or erase a column of trucks before anyone on the ground even heard them coming. The missions grew more daring. P-38s hit shipping lanes, oil refineries, and airfields across the Netherlands' East Indies. They hunted barges, locomotives, and troop convoys with terrifying precision. They were not only fighters now, they were strike bombers, pathfinders, and escorts all at once. The Lightning's reputation as the one-engine home plane became legend. Stories spread of pilots limping hundreds of miles on one dead motor, smoke trailing, fuel bleeding, landing with the last drops in the tanks. On the flight line, mechanics touched the bullet-scarred wings like relics. Some swore the aircraft itself had a will to live. In the Philippines, Major Thomas Maguire pushed that will to the limit. Already one of America's top aces, he led the 475th Fighter Group into mission after mission, carving his name into history beside Bong's. Maguire's leadership was strict, almost mathematical. He preached formation discipline, studied enemy maneuvers, and drilled his men in energy fighting. To his pilots, he was brilliant and relentless. But war respects no genius forever. In January 1945, chasing a Japanese fighter through low clouds over Los Negros Island, Maguire banked hard to cover a comrade and stalled at low speed. His Lightning rolled, struck the ground, and vanished in flame. The man who had taught others never to overcommit had done exactly that. His death sent a chill through every squadron. Even the best were mortal. Still, the fight went on. Bong, now a national hero, was ordered home for safety. He had 40 confirmed victories, more than any other American fighter pilot in history. The Lightning had carried him through them all. When he returned to the States, parades waited, cameras flashed, and crowds cheered. But Bong never boasted. "I just tried to bring my wingman home," he said quietly. Behind those personal stories lay a machinery of destruction unmatched in the war. Lockheed's factories in Burbank worked without pause. Women in headscarves and men too old for the draft-assembled Lightnings under fluorescent lights, riveting aluminium skins, installing engines, testing gun synchronizers. Every hour, another Lightning rolled out onto the tarmac, bound for the Pacific. In the Marianas, P-38s escorted B-24 and B-29 raids, sweeping ahead to clear the skies of resistance. Their range, stretched with new drop tanks and fuel modifications, made them indispensable in a region where islands were days apart by sea. Japanese pilots called them Shinen no Oni, demons of the abyss. The P-38s came from beyond the horizon, struck, and vanished again into the clouds. Their twin contrails, etched warning signs across the sky. In Europe, the same airplane fought a different war. The 8th Air Force used Lightnings for long-range escort before the Mustang arrived. Over Italy, Lightnings of the 12th Air Force tangled with German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, their turbocharged engines thriving where the thin alpine air robbed others of power. They flew reconnaissance over Normandy, strafed German supply lines, and knocked out radar stations along the coast before D-Day. The Lightning was global now, a machine of 2 wars, 2 oceans, 1 purpose. As 1945 dragged on, the skies over Japan itself began to darken with American bombers. From Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the first Lightning squadrons joined missions directly over the home islands. Their job was no longer just dogfighting, it was to paralyze the empire. They shredded airfields, power plants, and coastal defenses. They hunted trains through mountain passes, their gunfire sparking across steel rails. The Japanese could no longer respond in strength. Fuel shortages grounded many of their fighters. New pilots had barely a few hours of training. Those who took off often faced seasoned American aces, with hundreds of sorties behind them. The balance had shifted beyond recovery. Yet even in its triumph, the Lightning remained a demanding partner. Its systems required care, its engines constant tuning, its turbos patience. But those who learned its rhythms, those who treated it not as a machine, but as a living companion, spoke of it with reverence. They said it never betrayed them, that it always gave 1 more ounce of strength when they needed it most. When the war finally began to close in August 1945, thousands of Lightnings sat on Pacific airfields, engines silent, wings streaked with oil and salt. Some would fly occupation patrols over a defeated Japan. Others would be crated, shipped home, and forgotten. The world was already looking to jet engines, to speed beyond propellers, to a new kind of war. But for the men who had flown it, the P-38 would never be replaced. It was the bridge between eras, part science experiment, part guardian angel, part monster of the sky. It had carried them across oceans, through ambushes, through fire, and somehow brought them home. And in every squadron's fading photograph, behind every young, sunburned pilot grinning at the camera, the twin tails rose in the background, defiant, unmistakable, immortal. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the skies over the Pacific were filled not with smoke or thunder, but with silence, the kind of quiet that only comes after something immense has ended. On cracked coral runways from Okinawa to the Philippines, hundreds of P-38 Lightnings stood idle under the brutal sun. The machines that had carried the war across oceans now sat motionless, streaked with oil, salt, and memory. Pilots walked among them slowly, hands brushing along chipped paint, bullet scars, and names stenciled on the nose. Some aircraft bore dozens of mission marks, others just a few. Each one carried a story, a moment when courage, fear, and machine met in the thin air above the Pacific. In those last weeks, Japan's surrender confirmed what the men in those cockpits already knew. The Lightning had done what few thought possible. It had turned skepticism into awe, doubt into faith, and fear into legend. The end of the war came quietly for the P-38. The world had moved to jets, to the new sound of the future, the deep howl of turbines instead of pistons. To military planners, the Lightning was suddenly old. To the men who had flown her, she was irreplaceable. When many of them boarded ships for home, they left behind their aircraft without ceremony. Mechanics drained the fuel, taped over the gun ports, and marked the wings with white paint. Some lightnings were bulldozed into pits or pushed off cliffs into the sea. Others were sold for scrap, their aluminium melted into pots and pans for the post-war boom. But not all vanished. A few were saved by the same hands that had flown them. Veterans pooled their savings, bought worn-out airframes, and ferried them home across the ocean. They restored them piece by piece in barns and hangars, rebuilding the souls of old friends. One of them, a gleaming silver lightning with a name pudgy on its nose, was flown to air shows by Thomas Maguire's squadron mates in his honor. Another, Marge, was preserved at an airbase in Minnesota, visited each year by schoolchildren who knew only the stories. The war had changed everything. The world's maps had been redrawn, but so had the boundaries of flight. In 1939, the P-38's first prototype had seemed like a machine from another world. Twin engines, twin tails, a cockpit suspended between them like the head of an arrow. By 1945, it had become the symbol of America's reach, a weapon that could strike anywhere, at any altitude and return. The numbers alone were staggering. More than 10,000 lightnings built. Millions of gallons of fuel burned. Tens of thousands of sorties flown. Nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the Pacific and Europe combined. But behind each number stood a face: Bong, Maguire, Barber, Lanphier, and hundreds more whose names never made the newspapers. They had taken a machine everyone mocked and turned it into a legend. After the war, Lockheed test pilot Tony Levere was asked what the P-38 meant to him. He smiled and said, "It was like holding thunder in your hands. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." That was the truth of it. The lightning wasn't graceful, but it didn't need to be. It was power made aerodynamic, precision wrapped in aluminium. It could escort bombers, dive like a stone, climb like a homesick angel, and still bring its pilot home on one roaring engine. In 1947, the newly formed United States Air Force retired the last operational lightnings. The survivors were flown to storage depots or sold to foreign nations. Some went to Honduras, others to Italy, even a few to Central America. But wherever they flew, the legend followed. Ground crews still looked up when they heard that unmistakable whine, a note unlike any other, born from twin propellers spinning in opposite directions. Years later, when war veterans gathered at reunions, their stories always returned to the same sound: the hum before takeoff, the trembling cockpit, the moment when the throttles moved forward and both Allisons came alive. That sound was youth, fear, and faith, all at once. It was the lightning's heartbeat. At air shows decades later, when restored P-38s cut through the sky again, old men wept quietly. They said the noise of the turbos carried them back, to Bougainville, to New Guinea, to the Philippines, to a time when the world was burning and they were 20 years old. They remembered the laughter, the jokes about the twin-tailed monster and the over-engineered toy. They remembered the first missions that ended in failure, the doubts, the crashes. And then they remembered the shift, the moment when enemies stopped laughing and started running. The lightning had earned its name. It struck fast, struck hard, and changed the war. Today, a handful of P-38s still fly, their silver skins polished like mirrors. They appear at dawn over airfields, engines echoing through the morning mist. The crowds point, children stare, and for a heartbeat the old world returns, the thunder, the courage, the endless sky. And if you listen closely, through the whine of the props and the deep growl of the engines, you can almost hear the ghosts of those who flew them whispering the same words that ended 1,000 missions. Home base in sight. The P-38 Lightning began its life as a curiosity, a twin-tailed experiment that few believed in. It ended as a symbol of victory, engineering genius, and endurance. The pilots who first laughed at it learned to trust it with their lives. The enemies who mocked it came to fear the glint of its wings. And when the war was over, it had written one of the greatest redemption stories in aviation history. The sky that once belonged to others now belonged to the Lightning. And to the men who flew it, it always will.